we'll get started. I'm going to take myself off screen because you don't really need me. I imagine this will go pretty smoothly, but if not, I'll step in. But, this will be great. So, we'll start with opening statements. So Omni will go first, right? And then Katarana, and we'll go from there, all right? So off you go, Omni.
Yeah, so my basic contention is that it's true that environmental harm causes like things like pollution cause some amount of suffering. And so I think that the solution to that is a Pigouvian tax, where you impose a tax on the harm that is imposed upon societies, and then you don't impose other regulations. A Pigouvian tax is a better approach because it requires polluters pay both the costs that they impose upon society, but then they also get the benefits. So they have an incentive to only pollute if the benefits outweigh the costs.
Wait,
Well,
really quickly, in case the audience doesn't know exactly what the debate is about, you haven't really given any context of what you're talking about. So can you just give context?
Yeah, so the debate topic is about whether corporations should be allowed to pollute the environment. I think that they should if they pay the Pigouvian tax. And I think that a Pigouvian tax is a tax on pollution is a significantly better approach. 81% of top economists agree that a market-based system is significantly better than a command and control based approach. I think that command and control based approaches just generally do less well than market-based approaches. And so, for example, the ban on DDT has left millions of people at risk from malaria, the result of top-down planning for minimal environmental protection. In Madagascar, DDT spraying reduced cases of malaria by 90% as a result of the stringent restriction. And as a result of the inefficiency of top-down command and control regulations, according to a meta-analysis from Joseph Shapiro, on average, water regulations has benefits that are only 37% as great as its costs. And this is largely as a result of water regulations generally being command and control, while other types of regulations which do better are generally market-based. And so I think the solution is taxation and a market-based system. Yeah, so that's my basic contention.
Katarana?
Okay. First of all, I don't know what DDT is. Could you please clarify what that is?
Yeah, so it's a spray that was banned. It's effective at getting rid of mosquitoes, which carry malaria, but it was banned because it killed some birds.
Yeah, and just to give you a little bit more context on that, it was making the eggs of birds soft, so when they sat on them, they crushed their baby's eggs. So that's why they banned that.
Okay, cool. Let me just take myself off of push to talk actually, so I don't have to hold this for like a minute. 1 sec. Okay, cool. Yeah. So I find the idea of going ahead and implementing a tax as opposed to just having restrictions on corporations having the ability to destroy climates for the purpose of just infinite profit to be quite narrow-sighted. So that's assuming that this company doesn't make enough profits per year to the extent that this would become somewhat non-profitable for them to go ahead and be consistently charged for taxes. And companies such as Amazon, your top Fortune 500s, whatever tax that is going to be imposed is not going to be anything near being able to stop them if they were able to just do what they want as long as they pay off the taxes. As you can see, quite often these companies will have to go out and pay really huge fines at the end of the day for polluting environments and harming people, and they're able to just continue with what they're doing. They're just like, slightly lower bonus for the CEOs, but it's really not that serious. And I think it's very it's just strange to think of us on this planet as being the only things that matter. Of course, all of us are pretty species centric, but at a certain point, you're going to have to think that even if it's not harming our species directly, though eventually it does, but For example, with that whole situation with talking about the birds that end up being harmed, that form of bird may have overall contributed more to the ecosystem, and from there, food instability may occur. So it's very in your side, and just thinking, wow, I'm very happy that a company can, make $100 million extra dollars this year, as opposed to thinking that we're not the only things here, and it's not always about you. And this is a planet that we share with several different species, and we all work together. So it's just very, I don't know, it's a weird moral system, but I'm sure you're not awful. You'll explain further, I hope.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I mean, so I'll address the first point, which is that, well, corporations will just pollute and pay the tax. Well, no. So corporations' goal is to maximize profit, and so if you make it so that the cost that they impose is equal to the cost that they impose upon society generally, then they will only pollute if the benefits to them of whatever they're polluting for outweigh the costs. But I mean, in terms of if the income on low-income consumers, generally, it's command and control regulations that are more regressive than other regulations that have more exemptions and that raise costs on low-income consumers of energy more than market-based systems. I mean, the idea of a market-based system and of a Pigouvian tax is not some wacky idea that's unique to me. It's shared by 81% of top economists.
Oh, don't worry. I don't really have any conceptions that you're particularly original, made up this idea by yourself, but also I'm not sure if economists, when they're doing their evaluations, are keeping in mind all the other factors. And I'm sure for like economy purposes, yeah, this is a fine solution. But when I go look at these types of things, I think a bit more multifaceted than how is it going to go ahead and grow GDP, or how is it going to maximize profit for companies? Because that's not my first concern at all times. And yeah, of course, they're only going to build something if it's profitable for them. But at the end of the day, it will be more profitable for some companies over others. If we are deciding whether or not someone can knock down the Amazon rainforest, some companies will want to knock it down for a particular purpose that's not super profitable at the end of the day. When they look at the taxes, some companies will want to knock things down, and then what they want to do with it is particularly profitable, and they will pay for those taxes to cut down the rainforest. And at the end of the day, that ends up destroying not only habitat for several different indigenous people, which is probably part of this whole thing where we don't think too much about how this is going to affect humans and how it's going to affect different people's cultures. Because when we think about free markets, that's usually not the first thing we think about is how do people feel. But outside of that, it's going to end up, let's say in the example of that, destroying a lot of the CO2, I guess, things that suck up CO2 within our environment, which is a major issue. But hey, as long as they're paying the tax, then I guess it's fine, because free markets. I'm not sure if I really followed that logic. As long as they're paying the tax, then I'm happy. That's not my baseline. I'm not happy with them just paying the taxes.
Yeah, so okay, so in terms of the point about how the economists are not doing multifaceted analyses, I think that if you look at what economists do, it's a myth that just defies what economists actually do studies are. That
It's well known
that
that
well, wait,
economists tend to be
I
some of
wasn't
the
at the end of
like.
my
No, I know, but it's a debate, so I don't necessarily have to give you your full sentence, right? But
I hadn't even made my claim yet,
no,
and
but
then you
I'm
disagree with it
Oh,
before.
okay.
yeah. Trust
Okay.
me, Amaka. I won't
Okay.
talk
Well,
perpetually.
let Omni make his claim, and then you can respond.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
so I think that economists generally do a multifaceted account and attempt to compare different things. Um, I think generally different things are often comparable. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like the idea that you know better than 81% of economists, and that those 81% of economists were just not thinking of the biggest and most obvious downside, I think is implausible to say the least.
So it's pretty well known that when it comes to economists, it's almost as impressively homogenous as physics is. So some of the
Do you trust
anthropological
physicists?
perspectives, pardon?
Do you trust physicists?
Did, these are very different things. Economists are more of a social science, whereas physics is something that's a hard science. So I don't really need as much of the cultural differences to understand things, but it is seen that having people of different backgrounds is very often helpful for physicists. And I would say the same thing could happen with an economist. So, 81% of economists say this, but if, 81% of economists are all a bunch of libertarians, or even if they're not libertarians, if they're all Eurocentric people that don't really, whose environments are already pretty industrialized, and their culture isn't intrinsically tied to things such as what tree species are around due to certain rituals, then that's probably not going to be a factor that they throw in when they're deciding whether or not this is a good thing to do. So yeah, I
Yes.
wouldn't say, like, sure, they could have evaluated things like such as, is the environment going to be harmed, but it's more than, will we have more CO2 emissions? There's a lot more things that end up going into allowing different types of environments to be destroyed outside of, there's now more pollution. There's also things such as there's less species, there's less types of vegetation, people's cultures are intrinsically tied. This is going to ruin the light patterns for different types of animals, and there's going to be a huge spike of night out animals not being able to be alive in that area. And I don't think that's necessarily something that an economist is like, oh, let's talk about light pollution when they're going and making their analyses.
Yeah, so I think you're wrong about that, right? I mean, Nordhaus won a Nobel Prize when he was attempting to calculate the social costs of carbon. Economists very often attempt to sort of quantify how much environmental damage are caused by different things.
Were all the economists that looked into this happen to be economists that are multifaceted economists? Because, like, sure, some may have gone and done some of this analysis, but not all of them necessarily did.
Well, I don't know what you mean by a multifaceted economist, but this, I mean, in the
Well,
economics,
if I'm a physicist and we're talking about something that's biophysics, but there also happens to be a nuclear aspect to it, if I don't know anything about nuclear, then I'm only going to go ahead and look at something from a biophysics perspective, whereas I'm leaving off other types of perspectives when doing it.
oh, well, yeah, I mean, the consensus is, I think, even more overwhelming among economists who have looked at specifically environmental issues, right?
But what
So,
do you consider to be environmental issues? Are we just talking about emissions?
we'll know issues related to the environment, such as warming, biodiversity loss, etc. I mean, for example, Nordhaus won a Nobel Prize talking about the social cost of carbon. Paul Krugman, who's a very left-wing economist, he had some funny quote where he said, like, the one thing that, like, basically all economists agree on, which we can't get the general public to agree on because of their irrational phobia around taxes, is that a tax on pollution is a good thing. This crosses partisan lines among economists. But in terms of the point that you brought up about how it causes animal suffering, so I think that it's obviously true that some pollution causes animal suffering. But I generally think that habitat destruction is good at reducing animal suffering, right? So for the reason for this, and this is a pretty counterintuitive claim, but I think most animals in nature live fairly miserable lives. Most animals are R strategists, which means that they have a strategy that prioritizes quantity over survival. And so, for example, salmon lay about 5,000 eggs, tuna lay about 10 million eggs, molas lay about 800 million eggs. As a result of this, what you get is the vast majority, like above 99% of animals' lives consists of dying after a few days or weeks of existence, which is not a good life. And I think, given that, it would be better if there were fewer animals in nature. A paper by Oscar Horta was relying on some very, very conservative assumptions and concluded that even based on those, there are, for every time a type of tuna who's sort of a reasonable middle case reproduces, there are about 6,000 years worth of extreme agony. And the agony that they were talking about were the moments right before death. So, like, the suffering of starving to death or being eaten alive, etc. And so I think that, that agony is pretty bad, and it occurs for thousands of years.
Okay,
And
so
just,
If we go ahead, if we destroy habitats, does that make salmon suddenly stop laying 8 million eggs? Because there's still going
No,
to
it
be a
makes
large.
less salmon.
Pardon?
It makes there be less salmon.
Okay, but it doesn't change their pure biological process. And if they're when they lay all these eggs, the whole thing is natural selection. LOL, go do it. Having less of them is not going to stop the percentage of fish dying to living. It's just going to decrease the amount that are doing it.
Well, no, yeah, it will decrease the amount that are doing it. I think that most animals live miserable lives, and so it was better if there were fewer animals that were having millions of babies, most of whom were starving to death.
This is pretty eugenicsy. I don't.
Wait,
I,
okay.
no.
Wait.
Yeah,
Do you think that it is mortally bad when animals have millions of descendants, like the vast majority of whom starve to death?
that's the way their biological process has evolved, and like
Yeah, just because something has evolved a certain way does not make it normatively good, right? I mean, like in nature, we get smallpox. Smallpox has evolved to be infectious. Um, but I mean, that doesn't mean that smallpox is a good thing. We can't look at nature as a guide to normativity. I mean, for example, there are species of wasp who who reproduce by planting eggs inside other living beings, and so they hatch by just breaking through the skin en masse of the other living beings, whose skin just gets shredded in a bunch of different directions.
but,
While they're in
your
agony,
solution does
it seems
not.
like a bad thing.
Your solution doesn't change the percentage of agony. It just changed the amount of animals that are going through it. But at the end of the day, their biological process is naturally one of misery. So all you're doing is
And I think it's better for their
stabilizing.
suffering.
But do you understand how, sure, like a high percentage of them end up dying, but do you understand that the way that the amount that are there right now, if it's stable, then it is stable, and it's evolved in that way to very, very not tediously, but essentially these ecosystems are created on like a really fine balance. And if only one type of species ends up being decimated, if typically when things go extinct, it goes extinct over a prolonged amount of time. Other animals are able to decide, okay, I see that there's a lot less of this. Let me look into different food sources. If you're destroying, cutting down a bunch of trees, you're destroying a habitat just like that. And it's not going to be just, oh, well, if we're, building a dam here, there's not going to be a lot of fish, and that's the only thing that's going to be harmed. No, there's not going to be a lot of fish, so then there's not going to be a lot of bears to eat the fish, and then the bears are not going to be able to do this, and then this is not going to, it's not as easy as, well, some
Yeah.
are living really
Right,
good
but
lives, so I guess let's just get rid of, like, I don't
yeah,
understand the tree of
so
logic here. And
so
also, just a really quick thing, like, you're doing quotes from papers, but these aren't papers that you sent me ahead of time. So I, in no way, will actually be considering the quotes from the papers, as I have not been able to read the summary from the paper myself. So I don't believe, nor or I have no reason to believe that you're summarizing it properly. If I had time to look at it myself, I could say, okay, yes, I agree with this interpretation. But otherwise, give me a second. Let me just pull up a random thing from Mark saying Katarana's right. Like,
wait, okay. So I mean, do you think that I'm lying about what Oscar Horta was saying about the
I'm
6,000 years
say
worth of suffering?
I'm saying that it's cherry picking quotes is something very common in debates, but as an academic, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Well, wait, okay. So I mean, we can like Oscar Horta is extremely clear that this is his position, as is Tomasic. Quote from Tomasic.
Right, I can't read it myself, so that's
Well,
nice.
okay. I mean, I can send you the sources if you would like.
Give me a second. Let me make up a. Optical Centrum says that actually it's really, really good to not destroy habitats, and that it actually leads to 6,000 years of not suffering. Like, okay.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think I've given a like logical explanation, right? I mean, the vast majority of animals who are ever born die after living hours or days in extreme agony from starvation, predation, or some other extremely
Hey, did
for
you know that
modern
before
suffering.
modern medicine, a vast majority of human babies would die out of starvation, hunger, or just die? Like, yes, this
It wasn't the vast majority. But
it was it was
it was
more than
about
right now. So,
I think
it's okay to, and I hear there's this one continent that still has a really, really large number of that. So, you know what we should do? We should wipe out that entire continent because that's a lot of suffering that's happening there. And I want to put them out of their misery. Like, this doesn't
yeah.
make this,
So that's obviously not what I'm saying, right? Because with humans, so humans are case strategists, where even if there's a 15% or not 15, sorry, 50% mortality rate, which is about what it was, that still means that it's only one who dies for one who lives. And I think that that's a reasonable trade-off. But if it's 10 million who die for every one who lives, then I don't think that is. I mean, to give a hypothetical case, suppose that there was a human who just, I mean, this is obviously biologically impossible, but just who had 10 million children and left them all to starve to death. And the only way to prevent that was to destroy their house. Would that be okay?
sorry, could you state that
Yeah,
sentence?
so there's a human who's having 10 who's having 10 million babies, all of whom they're letting starve to death just immediately after birth. So they're just born and then they starve. And the only way to prevent that would be through destroying their home. Would that be permissible?
I think it's strange that you're equating a like human processes to these ones. Like at the end of the
Well,
day,
I
no,
mean,
it's just
you're
no,
the
no.
one who created the human processes because you claimed that my position was justifying eugenics. So I said it was not, and then I gave an example of where my logic would actually be applicable in a human situation, which is
So,
something I think you would agree with.
okay, so here, this is more like this is not analogous. Okay, so whereas for humans, if we went ahead and had 10 million children, one, we don't naturally just produce 10 million children, but if we produce, I don't know, triplets, and yeah, you're letting them all starve to death. This is something that in our current society is something that you could actually somewhat prevent. I could prevent my triplets from starving to death. I could reach out to people, etc. Whereas when it comes to salmon, they give off 10 million kids, and like there's not enough food, and by you getting rid of the habitat, once again, this process doesn't change, so your ratio is still going to be exactly the same, so it doesn't really
Yeah,
matter.
but we don't.
Like,
I don't care about the ratio, right? I just care about the number of sentient beings who are being born and then starving to death on their first day of life. And I think that it is bad when animals are born and starve to death, and this happens for millions, to millions of animals for each reproductive cycle. So that I think that it is better if there are fewer animals living lives of immense misery, which is why like the general consensus is that there's just way more suffering in nature than there is well-being. I would cite you sources that say that, but apparently you have an aversion to sources.
I don't have an aversion to sources. I have an aversion to giving sources in the middle of the debate, in which case I cannot read it. So if that was something that you wanted to bring up, then I would have had to read it ahead of time. That's Yeah. And if even if you gave it to me 3 hours ago, like, I could still say, okay, then it's my fault for not reading it in time. Right now, it could be cherry picking of quotes. I don't know.
All right. So I mean, now I think that there are certain environmental interventions that that reduce wild animal suffering. So I think that there's a plausible case to be made that global warming causes more wild animal suffering. One of the reasons why I think warming is bad, and I'm in favor of a carbon tax. But
Has
um,
carbon tax in its current state been able to curb enough emissions?
yeah,
Um,
Sweden did it, and they curbed emissions like way more than other countries in Europe, despite maintaining a high rate of economic growth.
sorry, which place did it?
Sweden,
Okay.
I think, maybe Norway. I'm pretty sure Sweden though. Um, I mean, like, so the thing is, pollution. Obviously, the optimal amount of pollution is not zero, right?
The
Do you agree
optimal
with that?
amount of pollution is not zero.
Right. Like there are certain activities that do produce pollution, but of benefits, that they're worthwhile overall.
Well, in a like pure ideal place, yes, it would be. It would be zero, but obviously, I don't. I live in reality, so
Right.
I'm aware that it's not possible.
Practically, you agree that even though pollution by itself is bad, there are certain activities that have benefits that outweigh the costs that outweigh the costs in terms of pollution, right?
I think it's all short term, in my opinion, because it doesn't matter if it creates 70,000 jobs, because if in 50 years that country that creates the jobs in is no longer livable, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah. So, well, but that's assuming certain assumption, or well, yeah, assuming assumptions. It's what you do with assumption. I mean, that is certain assumptions. Right now I'm just establishing that you can imagine cases. So, for example, if we could lift 1 billion people out of extreme poverty at the cost of releasing 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere, then presumably it would be a good thing, correct?
Yes, because 1 ton of CO2 is nothing significant. If it was saying
Okay,
lifting
so
1 billion people out of poverty, but it releases like, I don't know, 2,000 gigatons of CO2, and that happens to be the exact number that puts us over the threshold of no longer being a viable planet, then no, I wouldn't say it was. But
right,
that's
so
cost benefit
so
analysis.
yeah, so pollution is obviously a cost, but then it can have benefits that outweigh the cost. And so if we want to weigh the costs against the benefits to determine if the benefits outweigh the costs, then the solution is to make it so that the companies who are polluting have to bear the costs that they impose upon society. And so because the benefits get taken into account in terms of how much profit that they make. But then by having a tax, they pay the costs, which is why there's overwhelming support among economists who get this. Well,
But
for economists anyway, because economists get this.
Well, when companies are doing this to do the cost benefit analysis, a lot I find like the cost is to them, this costs us money, and the benefits is it's gonna make us more money. But the cost benefit analysis, um, at the end of the day, never ends up being something like, hey, let's sit here and think about like the actual morals of this. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna release, 2,000 gigatons, but
Well,
4 people will
yes.
get jobs, and like that cost benefit analysis is not very I
Yeah,
wouldn't
so
agree with that
okay.
analysis, but they would still do it if they end up making more money than losing.
Right. So do you agree that when we weigh that there's a way, at least in principle, to figure out how much harm is being imposed?
With proper models, yes.
Right. So we can figure out how much cost is being imposed, and then we can model that in terms of money, right?
How much cost is being imposed, but then we can model that in money. I don't know if every
Right. And
country necessarily has those tools to be able to do that.
well, wait, do you deny that like we can transfer the disutility of pollution into a monetary cost?
Can you put a price on the amount of like countries that are no longer going to be livable? I don't
Well, yeah, I mean, well, yeah, I think of course you can, right? I mean,
I don't
you
really
know,
think there should be a price tag on that, like, it's
the
not livable anymore, so you can't do
well,
that.
okay, the cost would obviously be pretty high, right? If it is making an entire country
So,
unlivable.
as long as Amazon can, like, shit up $1 trillion, then yeah, sure, go ahead and build. I mean, Malta's fucking flooded, but that's chill.
Well,
Go
no,
off
I mean,
king.
it would presumably have to be more than $1 trillion. But I mean, the thing is, a human life is not worth an infinite amount of value. A human life is worth a lot of value, but it's certainly not an impact, or not an impact, an infinite amount of value, right? Because if it were, then it would be worth spending half of the global GDP to save one human life. People have quality of life, and their quality of life can be improved by more wealth. And so, if there is a cost to humans, but then we can weigh that cost against the benefits and that people get, right?
I think, I think we should be spending a lot more money to save human lives, but in our current society, we believe certain types of lives are worth more than others, and that's not like Yeah, that's not really a moral system that I prescribe to. And clearly, we do a lot to make sure that certain countries have social welfare
Y-
systems, but
y-
we don't really do the same amount of work to see how can we put other countries' governments into more stable conditions so that they can have the same rights and the same quality of life. So, yeah, most of the time, the places that end up being potentially wiped out are countries that are in a lower quartile of GDP and are mostly filled with BIPOC people. So yeah, companies don't give a fuck. But
Yeah. Okay.
like that's
So,
not really
so
like something just because we
wait,
don't necessarily
the
prescribe.
question, the question is just: do you think that we can put a price on a human life?
I like in the sense that okay, like do I the whole philosophy question of like do I run over five versus one? Sure, but I don't really.
Wait, no. So the question of whether you can put a cost on a human life, is a different question from the trolley problem. Trolley problem is about weighing up different lives, right? But I mean, do you think that we can put a price on a human life? We can say like we would be willing to spend
$7 million to kill one person. I would hope that this is something that we would just say, oh well, yeah, if you can pay it, sure. Like,
well, I mean, yeah. So
I get
so
clearly we do put cost on human lives because if companies give you a product that happens to kill your loved one, they give you a
yeah,
payout.
so the
So
question
that
is, should we, not do we?
oh, should we? I would prefer not, but I mean, if it
Okay,
means
so
do
right, so if
I don't entirely understand. Like, can I understand what you're trying to get at so I can actually
okay,
answer this? Because I just don't understand like what you're trying to ask.
okay, so if you say that we can't put a price on a human life, then you would have to say that any amount of money would be worth spending if it reduced the chance of death by any amount. And that's obviously absurd. We would not be willing to spend half the GDP of the world to save one person's life because GDP can increase people's quality of life such that it brings about more total benefit to the world than the life of one person.
I think there's just a bit of a misunderstanding of if a company does make more money, what will that actually go towards doing? If we said, if we destroy the habitat of Malta, but we also find a way to make sure that the people there have somewhere to go, and we give them all a better cost of living, and we go and negotiate with them saying, hey, we really need the resources here, so can we displace you? And everyone agrees to it. Then, if they want to do that at the end of the day, I would have slightly less moral qualms with it. But if the idea is, well, this technically is, we're going to make the amount of money that's worth all the lives of people on Malta. We're not necessarily going to help them. That's their problem. We get to make the money as a company, and we extract the profits, and we're not even creating really that many additional jobs. I mean, we could basically lift everybody that works in this company to making $50,000 a year as opposed to
Wait,
30, but we're not
yeah,
going to. And the like stakeholders get to have higher dividends. Then no, I would not say that's something that's worth doing, even if it raises the GDP of the company. Because if it's not going towards net good, which most of the time it does not,
no,
in the cases
so
of corporations, then no.
but so whether the company does good things is like overall it's not relevant to the question of just whether we can place a price on a human life. If we can't, then you would have to say that we would be willing to spend any amount of money and sacrifice any amount of wealth uh, to uh, to to save a human life. And yet that's an absurd notion, right? We need to be practical and look at the costs and the benefits. And a human life does not have some infinite value such that we can never do anything that costs any lives, even if it would lift millions of people out of poverty, right?
So a lot of things that we end up doing will have a cost at the end of the day to human lives. Building an Amazon factory probably caused one extra person to die as a result, because now there's a shorter route to get or a longer route to get to the ambulance. But obviously, these are analyses that we do consistently, and we said, okay, yes, though we know this will, cause the ambulance ride to be 30 seconds longer. That's something that we're willing to do. But I think when we're going into the area saying we're going to destroy habitats, it's the analysis isn't as much as abstract as okay, this might be a bit longer. Just says, yes, there's going to be a lot more pollution and there's going to be a lot less biodiversity, and it's not going to affect just one person or two people. It's going to affect a lot of people. Then I don't think that these, even if the profits end up exceeding the calculations that we decide a human life is worth, I don't think that's really worth it at the
Yeah,
end of
well, I mean, so the people who are paying the higher prices for goods are not like just wealthy billionaires. The people who are paying the higher price for the goods are often low income people. So, I mean, the DDT ban, for example, has led to large numbers of people getting malaria because while DDT does produce environmental harm, it also it also is the most effective way of preventing malaria. And so I mean, that's one example of command and control regulations that are really bad. That's why generally environmental.
Is this a consensus that people have had that not having this particular chemical and that there were absolutely no substitutions that they could use?
Well, there were
And
substitutions, but they were just less effective.
okay, and there were any other mechanisms that like this may just be a bit of the whole situation of there's something that could have been done, but since it's Madagascar, no one did the additional work that had to be done, and thus people died. But I don't think it's like one or the other. Like if Madagascar was in a different economic standing point, then this would not have been.
Yeah.
If this was catastrophic, it would have been as catastrophic.
I
So
mean,
I think
if things were different, they would be different. Is not relevant given that in the context of this situation, for like in the Madagascar case, which you talked about, DDT spraying had reduced cases of malaria by 90%. But it's the number of cases after DDT spraying stopped as a result largely of the United States and other Western countries pushing to ban it overseas. They began to skyrocket. In Sri Lanka, they'd almost completely eliminated malaria, but then the rates of malaria started to increase dramatically after there was a ban on DDT. So there is a cost in human lives. There is a cost in human lives when there are higher prices for energy and for food.
something being a higher cost and a chemical being necessary to get rid of malaria or not, these are not the same points
Wait,
that you're
so
making.
do you deny that when food costs are higher, that it is more difficult for low income people to buy food?
Yes, I too live in society with your point.
Right. So your policies that you think are a good idea are opposed by the overwhelming majority of economists. They're generally more aggressive than market-based approaches. We have good economic theoretical reasons to think that that Pigouvian taxes are a much better approach. I mean, the studies have consistently found empirical support for market-based systems rather than top-down environmental regulations.
Have companies building a plant somewhere and potentially destroying an environment by making more profit? Do you believe in like trickle down economics and somehow they're going to give us saving as consumers just because they're making extra money? Like,
Well,
when have you seen that happen that they've real like that
I think
they
that's true to some. I think that's true to some degree, but I mean that's not relevant to the question of which environmental policy is better. Even if you're someone like
Well, no,
Paul,
but you just said that people that are poor want to pay less, and it's like, yes, of course they want to pay less. Of course, people don't want to pay more money. But if we were to go and deregulate all these things and only have this type of tax, so companies are getting taxed as opposed to not being able to build at all, and thus having additional profit. Why would that change anything about the poorest people not being able to afford the thing? Like if it's 20, it's not gonna that
is
additional profit's not gonna come to us. We're not gonna get discounts.
is your view that if we impose environmental regulations that raise the costs of things like food production, cost to produce cars, etc., it will not lead to higher prices, but all of the profit decreases will come out of the pocket of the CEO?
Pardon?
Do,
I just need you to I just need you to
is
just
your view that
restate a
if we
sentence.
raise the costs of inputs, it will just the only decrease in money, like the cost, the cost of the increased costs of inputs in terms of whatever the product is, but the increased cost will only come out of the salary of the CEO and won't be
I never
represented.
said that. I never said that.
Okay,
The
so do you agree that environmental regulations impose higher prices on people who need, on low-income people largely?
I'm saying that I don't see any data of use of any situations of a country changing from having the restrictions to having the tax has somehow changed the prices for the consumer. Like as soon
Well,
as they switch from this to this, suddenly do they drop the prices by 30%? Like what?
I
I,
mean,
I recognize that it's not coming out of the pocket of the CEO, but I also recognize that like the profits are not going to come into form of savings for us.
like for example, the Canadian provinces that have a carbon tax have higher economic that don't.
Have
Sweden
higher what?
have higher rates of economic growth than the ones that do not.
The provinces in Canada that don't have environmental regulations?
Well, the ones with a carbon tax have higher growth than the ones that don't have a carbon tax.
That could just be a correlation is not causation. Like, okay.
Yeah, that's true, right? But it is at the very least evidence for it, right?
No, it's not.
Wait, it's not. Wait, so you don't think correlation provides any evidence at all for the claim?
Not necessarily. That things are more multifaceted than well, everybody in Ontario has a blue car, so that must be why they have a higher like that. What? No.
Yeah. So I'm using evidence in the Bayesian sense of so whatever your probability was before the data came in, whether the probability should be higher after updating on the data, right? I think that our probability in carbon taxes being good for growth should be higher after updating on the data of the Canadian provinces that have more economic growth or that have carbon taxes have more economic growth. Now, there are factors. And it could be the case that it's as a result of other factors. But this is evidence for the claim. It's not very strong evidence for the claim.
Then why make the claim? Like,
Well,
if it's not strong evidence, then
as providing evidence for the claim.
yeah.
So do you agree that that is evidence for the claim?
I gave my own like version of it. Like, no, not really. Like that doesn't.
What you gave is a possible case in which you could have those things both happen, but without the conclusion that carbon taxes increase economic growth being true, right? I don't deny that.
That's a possible claim, but like I don't necessarily really have to take much of it into account because, as I said, like Ontario has more blue cars. Must be why there's like okay, like that's not
Okay.
Has there been any definitive conclusion to that? Like, okay, no.
Wait, has there been? Well, no. So I agree that it's not single-handedly conclusive, but it certainly is evidence for the claim.
Okay. I just don't consider it strong evidence, and I could also
Sure.
find other
I
reasons
don't think
why. I could find other reasons why, like for example, if we're talking about a place like Ontario, oh, okay, well, most headquarters are there, and most headquarters are there because in 1970, when Quebec wanted to go and separate from Canada, a bunch of companies decided to move to Ontario as it's a closer place. It has access to a seat. Like, there's other reasons to explain that, and carbon tax is just like one. Like there's other ways where we could explain some of the economic growth in different provinces.
Right. So another piece of evidence claim. So Nordhaus and Boyer, Nordhaus won a Nobel. They released a paper, and their conclusion was that current approaches, such as the Kyoto Protocol, are highly inefficient, with abatement costs approximately 10 times their benefit in reduced damages. So they concluded that current environmental approaches, such as, for example, the Kyoto Protocol is the example that they gave, generally do more harm than good. But the solution that they advocated for, which was a carbon tax, they said it would do more good than harm.
Okay, I haven't seen this paper, so okay, like cool. I'm happy for them.
So I've given the theoretical reason.
No, I don't really I can't even hear, like your mic's not that good, so I hardly heard what you said. Like I heard Nobel Prize winner. Sometimes when you speak, some of the words end up not being translated for some reason, like your microphone cuts off some of the words. So I don't entirely understand what you just said besides
Okay,
carbon tax plus Nobel Prize.
Okay, Omni, just say it again, please.
Yeah, so the TLDR version is that Well, actually, I'll just repeat what I said. So the conclusion from Nordhaus and Boyer, Nordhaus went on to win a Nobel Prize, is that current approaches such as the Kyoto Protocol are highly inefficient, with abatement costs approximately 10 times their benefits and reduced damages. But they found that a carbon tax would have
What's
benefits.
Kyoto Protocol?
What?
What's Kyoto Protocol?
Wait, you don't know what the Kyoto Protocol is? It was a big environmental convention that involved us, like that was signed that involved nations adopting a series of environmental regulation.
Okay, yeah,
Right.
I'm a physicist, not environment.
It employed a command and control based approach.
Okay, yeah, I don't know what it is, so I can't really. I don't know what's so different from one to the other. So to me, you just said words.
Right. So I mean, I've given what the economic consensus is 81% support among top economists. I've given a series of papers, including a meta-analysis and papers from a Nobel Prize winner, which have supported the position that I'm claiming is true. I've given the economic theoretical reason to assume that a carbon tax is a better what's the word solution. Sorry,
And I'm
going
sure in an economic sense, it's a good solution for in an
well, no,
economic sense, but that's not the only like that economic sense is not like the basis of why I would say something should happen or not. I
yeah.
think
So
it's more nuanced than just infinite growth go high. Like that's not
okay, so economists are, well, I mean, I think that growth is a good thing. If the United States had had a GDP growth rate 1% less over the past century, our current GDP per capita would be lower than that of Mexico,
okay.
right?
And as if GDP, as if money is properly distributed within the country,
Well,
like
money is not properly distributed, but median consumption went up 51% between 1950 and 2001. I
okay.
mean, the income of the average worker was going up.
Yeah, hardly. Have you seen the rate that like the tracking over the last 50 years of how production has increased and productivity increases, but wages haven't? So I don't know. I
Well,
mean, clearly we're
wages
making more and more money, but it's not being distributed in a particularly amazing way.
Well, yeah. So I mean, wages have gone up. The point about increased productivity is so it's true, but it doesn't take into account things like, for example, increased capital costs. So in a vacuum, while a laborer may be producing more, it doesn't account for the things that the company had spent, which would increase the productivity of the laborer. But the income of the average worker has been going up substantially. The claims that incomes are stagnating are wrong, and they're generally supported by only looking at family income, which is problematic because families have been getting smaller on average. And this idea that there's just some fixed class of rich people at the very top who are the only ones getting better is contradicted by the fact that there's a huge amount of income mobility. So 56% of people will have at least 1 year of their life where they're in the top 10% in terms of income. 12% of people will have at least 1 year where they're in the top 1%.
Within the states have some of the worst income mobility out of all the Western countries. Even though it is the one of the richest country in general, yeah, the income mobility here is absolutely shit.
Well, okay, so I mean, but even if that's true, which I don't think it is, it's not relevant to the claim that just there is mobility. So if the top 1% gets more
Yeah,
wealth, that's
there's
not 1%
mobility.
of people.
There's mobility in Afghanistan. So what?
But
It's.
there's also what like the average person is much poorer in Afghanistan, right? And
I mean, there's mobility everywhere. It's not really something that's special to this country, even though it does infinite growth for infinite growth sakes.
well, wait, I mean, are you opposed to economic growth?
I'm not opposed to economic growth. Clearly, it's what is required for being competitive. But I don't think economic growth in while also saying it's okay to destroy environments is like a
Well,
good trade off.
yeah. So I mean, well, I think I've given my defense of destroying the environment are good for non-human animals, right? Given that most
I don't agree with your analysis on that. Well, clearly, a large percentage of like different types of fish are giving having a bunch of offspring, and that ends up being animal suffering. So let's just actually eradicate that species. I don't want them to continue doing that. Though you went ahead and looked at the different types of fish species that have a bunch of eggs in batch, but you named off a couple of them. But as far as I'm aware, and I could be wrong, most fish species end up laying a bunch of eggs all at once. So that's not something that is very unique to either salmon, trout, whatever.
Right, yeah, it's not, and that's the point.
So should we just get rid of all fish? Like that?
No, we shouldn't get rid of all fish, because getting rid of all fish would have significant negative impacts on humans that I think would outweigh. But I do think that if there were fewer fish in the sea, all else equal, that would be a good thing.
And I would say that if we were to ask any ecologist, they would disagree with you. And economists are not ecologists.
Well, I mean, some economists are ecologists, but I mean, so I think that the claim that all ecologists would disagree with me is false. I think some ecologists would certainly agree with me, right? But I mean, I don't think that you have data that supports that claim, and I think that it's a counterintuitive position, and so it's not surprising that it would be that it would be in the minority. But I mean, do you have like a substantive disagreement with either the claim that it's good? Well, wait. First of all, are you? I'm a utilitarian. Are you not a utilitarian?
What's your definition of utilitarian?
The utilitarian thinks that we should try to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures.
That kind of seems like a bit of a trap question. Like, would I say no? I don't really.
The question of whether you're a utilitarian is a trap.
No, like I'm saying with that definition, like, would I say no? I
mean, that's
all
like
conscientious creatures eat shit. Like, I don't. Like, sure, but like, I guess at some point, like, you might say, well, I as a utilitarian believe that this policy makes sense, and I'd say, like, no, I don't agree with you, and then you'd be like, wow, you're not really a utilitarian. So,
well, I mean,
I'll say tentatively yes.
Disagree about what maximizes well-being, but would you agree that if something maximized the well-being of conscious creatures, then it would be a good idea? We might have substantive disagreements about what would, but if it did, it would be good.
Sure. Like,
okay, great. So it seems to be bad for the well-being of conscious creatures for most animals to live in extreme misery.
Really quickly, a bunch of people in my chat are saying that your definition's wrong. So I guess.
Okay, wait. What part of the definition do they think is wrong?
Give them a bit.
Okay.
No, you can continue. I'll just read it off.
So do you disagree with the substantive claim that most animals live short lives of extreme agony?
Okay, and if I agree, should that natural progression be then kill them?
Well, so I mean, not necessarily, but I mean, just we're getting the like premises of the argument and seeing which one you disagree with. So do you disagree with that claim that most animals live short lives of extreme suffering?
I can't really prescribe. I can't say it because I don't know. Like, perhaps in our case, we're talking about fish. Sure, we may look at other species, and then I would disagree. So I can't really say yes because I don't have enough data on how all different types of species live. So I am not going to agree to that.
Right. So wait. Okay. So you're. I mean, do you agree with the claim that most animals are strategists?
Yes. Wait, what's your definition of strategist?
Okay, well, no, so an R strategist is an animal that has massive numbers of descendants. So like salmon, who weigh 10 million eggs, molas, who weigh 800 million eggs, etc.
Okay, yeah, sorry, then no, I can't give you a yes or no on that again either because some animals don't lay very many eggs, some do.
Okay, I mean, this is a Googleable fact. Most animals are strategists. And even
I never claimed to be a biologist, and I'm pretty sure you're not either. So it's not an answer I can give you, and I'm not going to. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, but even if it were the case that most animals are strategists, it would still, just given how many offspring they have, and the R strategists have, it would still be the case that most animals are born to R strategists. So like, the majority of fish are R strategists. Right. So, I mean, you can like disagree with that. I mean, this is just like it is not a contestable fact that most animals are R strategists. It is a contestable fact that there's more suffering than well-being. But I mean, there would not
I'm
be.
not arguing with you about whether or not is. I said I don't know. I'm not saying that you're wrong. I said I don't know, and I'd rather say I don't know than disagree for the sake of disagreeing. So I'd rather just say I don't know if I don't know.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, if both of those are the case, then that means that the lives of the vast majority of sentient beings of being born, living a very, very short life, and then dying before reproducing. Do you think that that is a good life that is worth living?
We could say the same thing quite a lot within our own species. So I don't know.
Do you
You
think
tell
that,
me.
the vast majority of humans die after a few days of existence?
I'm not saying the mass majority, but like this seems like a moral question that you have to answer yourself. Because if we say, okay, I have a child and the kid we know ahead of time will have progeria, do you get rid of it or not? They're definitely not going to make it to reproducing. I don't know. You tell
Well,
me. Like,
if
is it worth
they
it?
were going to die after like 2 days of existence in extreme agony, then do you think that it would be like bad to
I
not bring?
I just don't understand why you keep on resulting to this because if that okay, so if I concede and say yes, that's true, you destroying the ecosystem does not change their breeding process.
It doesn't change the ratio, but it makes it so that there are fewer beings
So let's
who.
just get rid of all animals because they're all in agony all the time. Like this is
No, so
where it eventually ends up leading to, and that doesn't make any sense.
right. So I mean, they're not all in agony all of the time. And there are certain animals that I think experience more well-being than suffering. So, for example, I think that K strategists like deer and antelope, probably, and humans have a lot more well-being than suffering. But I think that fish like mola mola, who for every two who survive, there are like 800 million who die before reproducing. That seems like a bad thing.
So let's
And
just get rid of that entire species.
yeah, of course. I mean that is that is my position.
That doesn't make any sense because if we got rid of an entire species, okay, yes, a huge ratio of this species will end up dying, but if we get rid of that species, other species that don't live what you consider to be miserable existences will also end up dying because if they no longer have that food source, then they no longer have something to live off of, and then they also end up dying of starvation. Like it's just so like short-sighted,
Right.
like
Well,
not
so
understanding how things are tied together.
yeah, so a few things. One is that ecosystems are generally relatively resilient. So if one species so like if
No,
predators die,
they are resistant, but they're not resistant within a time that like sure, if Earth were to go from being on average 28 degrees Celsius to 50 degrees Celsius all within the next 10 years, no, we would not survive that. Same thing goes with this. If we were to get rid of an entire food source within a very like less than lifespan of some animals, because if we're doing it for industrialization purposes, we could destroy an entire ecosystem or at least an entire specific species in this ecosystem in less than 5 years, then no, they're not that resilient. They're not just going to be like, oh, okay, well, yeah, I guess we'll just cook our own food now. And obviously, this is a
yeah, okay,
hyperbole.
so
No,
so,
I
so
know, like they will not be that resilient. Like adaptations do not
animals are
happen within
resilient.
five.
There has been about a 50% decline in global in the total number of animals that have been alive on Earth, and it has not had these cataclysmic effects that
But
have
it
led to
hasn't happened within 5 years. It happened over the course of thousands of years. Where
no, it didn't happen. No, it's largely spurred as a result of short-term human action.
which animal species are we alluding to here?
Well, I mean, a huge number of animals haven't been or have died off.
Okay, yes, yeah, a huge number of animals, but did like, for example, did we destroy the entire ecosystem? Like the entire, I don't know, a specific rainforest in which we got rid of every single species there, including the ones that you don't consider to have miserable existences? Or did we get rid of a very specific species and then a bunch of them ended up dying off now because they no longer had access to a food source? Because
Well,
at the end of the day, I don't agree with either one of these, because if we're doing the what you call utilitarian approach, both of them end up suffering all at once, and one is a species that would, you would say, on average have more less visible existences, yet we still killed them off even though they could have had very fruitful lives or whatever. Or
well, yeah, no,
but
so I think it's obviously bad when animals who have more well-being than suffering die off. I think it's good, all else equal, when animals who have more suffering than well-being die off. Now, there are obviously other ecosystem effects that have to be
that's always the thing. There are always more ecosystem effects. There's never just an animal
right.
that lives in its
I
own little
mean,
bubble in
yeah,
which.
so my argument is that most animals live bad lives, so all else equal, it is better if there are fewer animals. There are ecosystem effects, but based on that framework, what reason do we have to think that the ecosystem effects are usually bad?
What framework do we have to think that the ecosystem effects are usually bad?
Right, the ecosystem spillover effects. I
Sorry.
mean, it could be the case that a species dies off causes other species to die off who are also
Yeah.
our strategy and
Mm,
overall good.
Sorry,
But
I really checkly was just checking. I actually have to leave within 18 minutes because my shift at work starts. But yeah, I was just checking that because I want to make sure to see whether or not I started at 1 or at 12:30. But yeah, sorry. Can you repeat that?
uh, yeah, so sorry, I lost my train of thought. Yeah,
Environmental spillover.
yeah. So what reason do you have to think that the spillover effect will generally have a negative effect rather than a positive? Because it could be the case that if a type of fish dies off, other animals also die off who are also our strategists, generally have more misery than well-being.
But quite often these species will interact with each other. Like it's not just what you consider to be our strategists that are only eating each other, and only case
Well, yeah,
strategists that are only eating each other. So if you end up losing an R strategist, then K strategists will be affected.
yeah, I agree that K strategists will be affected, and I think it's bad when K strategists die off. But we can weigh a thing that's bad against a thing that is both, right? And so I think that the misery of the quadrillions of animals who exist, who most of whom live short, miserable lives of extreme suffering, makes it such that generally harms to K strategists are well existing and are bad, they're not sufficient to outweigh the harms to our strategists or the benefits to our strategists in most cases.
In a way kind of analogous to the argument of, okay, so there are some humans on earth that have a lot more kids than other humans. The ones that have less kids tend to be have happier existences. The ones that have a lot of kids tend to have less happy existences. A lot of the reason why certain humans will have 8, 10 kids is because those certain families are impoverished, and they need to have more kids to say, "A, will somebody take care of me when I get old?" And take care of the farm and stuff like that. But overall, they're living literally just for the purpose of living, such as they can only afford eating and can only afford essentially eating. Now, should we go ahead and get rid of like some of these types of humans on the earth that have 10 kids
Yes.
because of.
So obviously not, right? Because having 10 offspring is still in the realm of K strategists. But if you have like millions of offsprings, then you are firmly in the realm of our strategist. If there was a human who was having millions of offspring and letting them all starve, and the only way to prevent them from having millions of offspring who they let starve to death was to kill them, I think that would be a good thing. Because I think that millions of sentient beings starving to death in extreme agony is a bad thing.
I guess in a framework wise, neither one of us are going to end up conceding here.
Well, I mean, so I've given an ethical system, which you didn't seem to have any disagreement that ended up contradicting your position, in which case you would go back on it. And I've
Sorry,
given an
you lagged
empirical
out. You lagged out for a second. And you said, so I said that we're not going to concede, and then I didn't hear what you said after that.
right. So I gave a philosophical, or I gave a position which you were okay with up until the point when it, unless it contradicted your position. I mean, I can
So
give you the arguments for
up until where did
utilitarianism.
so I agreed with you up until I said, okay, sure, utilitarianism.
Right. So you agree that utilitarianism is fine, right?
With whatever definition that you have, sure.
Yeah. Okay, right. And that animals generally have way more suffering than well-being, right?
Yes.
Okay, so from both of those things, it would maximize well-being if there were fewer animals, right? Because most animals have more suffering than well-being.
I guess it's just what's the metric for suffering? Because to me, no
Well,
matter what, whatever.
suffering is bad experience. The experiences that would be better if they didn't
I mean,
happen.
all of us end up kicking the bucket. So, at what, like, why do we consider one, like having a lengthier life to be somehow less, like, somehow better for well-being than the other? I can
Because
have a miserable long existence.
because death
Currently
is
doing it.
because death is generally pretty unpleasant, particularly the way it occurs in nature in extreme agony when animals die of disease, starvation, or being eaten alive by predators.
And
In
that's
ex-
not what happens for cave predators and like deer
it does
end up.
happen for predators,
Oh,
but I think
yeah,
for
but I think
extractives,
you're just kind of thinking of like the framework of outside of human civilization. No matter what, most species, even the ones that are not laying 85,000 eggs, are still going to die of what you consider a miserable existence. Like they will die either of starvation, they will die either
right.
of being
So
eaten. Like
yeah, so the suffering of death is a bad thing, but it can, in certain cases, be outweighed by the well-being that they get over the course of their life, right? So, I mean, it could be the case that you have a painful death, but you just lived a really happy life. And so, as a result of that, the overall
that's
amount of
strange. I could say that my 3 seconds of being alive were a happy life. I opened my eyes and
yeah,
then I
so
died of
well, right,
starvation.
so we should consider the specific cases. Would you want to be born as a fish who is born, lives for a few hours, and then dies from being eaten alive by a shark?
Would you want to be a deer that's alive for 5 years and then gets eaten by a bear? Like it all just it
I mean,
doesn't
yeah,
make
sure,
sense
I
to
think
me.
so.
I don't see the difference between being
Well, yeah,
alive for the sake of being alive.
I would do that.
I don't see a difference. Dying right now as a 23-year-old or dying 7 years due to cancer. I don't now or later, kill me now. I don't care. It's the same thing to me.
Well, wait, so I mean, so
I see no utility in like where we say wellness is as long as you're alive for longer. Like
yeah, no, so being alive for longer, obviously, it does not well-being. Um, if the time of their life has more suffering than well-being, but death is really bad, and so it takes a lot of good experiences to outweigh the badness of death. And a few hours of existence before dying in just extreme agony. Like, I mean, I wouldn't take an extra
but
year of
all
existence.
but all of them most animals, no matter if it's one that lays 8 million eggs or 5, most of them do end up not dying of natural causes. Most of them end up dying of extreme agony. So no matter what is a
Deaths
process,
from
a lot
natural
of them are going to
causes
end up
can
going
be
through.
extreme agony.
Pardon?
Deaths from natural causes can cause extreme agony.
Death from natural causes can be extreme agony.
Can cause extreme agony.
Yes, and I'm saying that most animals will go through the same thing. Like dying, being
Right.
eaten by a shark,
Yeah.
or
Okay.
dying, being eaten by a bear. It's the same shit. You're still being eaten. It's not
Which part of the argument? Which part of the argument do you disagree with? Do you disagree that there can be?
over.
Do
At the end of the
you
day, I disagree with everything. When I leave this conversation, I'm still going to say I don't think that having your tax is better than having regulations. So I would say, what part do I disagree with? Everything.
right. But let's go claim by claim. So do you agree with the claim that there is a number of good experiences that could accumulate such that a person had more well-being that has enough well-being that it outweighs the suffering of their death, such that overall their life is worth living? Do you agree with that?
No.
You don't? Wait, so you think that, so if you had trillions of years of bliss beyond what we could imagine, but then at the end of it, you died in a way that was painful, you think that that life would not be worth
On paper, one could say that I've been living a really good life because good things happen, but then bad things also happen along the way, as it
Yeah,
does
but
for most
yeah,
humans.
so
So
yeah, no, but I'm not asking about your life. I'm asking about in a hypothetical case where there is a person who has trillions of years of extreme bliss beyond what we can conceive of. Do you agree that for that person, it would be that even if they had a painful death, their life would overall be worth living?
some would say that someone that has happy 1 year, their life is still worth living. I don't really see
Yeah,
what
so right. I mean, I'm not asking about what some people would say. I'm asking,
I'm
do
not.
would you
I don't,
agree if your
because
life
I
would be worth
understand, like, when
your
it
life
comes
would
to
be worth
debates,
living?
people ask these setups, and the whole point is to go and lead to something that I might disagree with. But why don't you just tell me the thing that you want me to eventually answer, rather than playing 21 questions to get there?
Well, I gave you a series of arguments for why the suffering in nature is outweighs the well-being, and why, on my view, that justifies they would be better if there were fewer animals, and if ecosystem destruction brings about fewer animals, then that is a good thing. Your response was
Am
just a
I just
Oh,
posture
let
about,
him
oh, well,
finish.
what about
Omni, go ahead.
what? Your answer was just a posture about, well, oh, but what about the animals who die, while not rejecting any of the premises? So now I'm going through the premises and acting which one you reject.
okay? So what I would say is that I still end up disagreeing, because the thing is, okay, so there's a whole bunch of suffering within the animal kingdom, but I think that destroying a bunch of environments does not end up fixing any of the percentages. And I know it's like, oh, okay, but no, we just get rid of a whole bunch of them. So then now even though the percentage doesn't change, now there's less animals going through it. And it's like, I don't know, who put us in charge of balancing out the entire ecosystem. It's been framed this way for a reason. It's already on a very like a slight balance, and it's like not even understanding like cause and effect. And we get rid of one, and it's just like, okay, well, now there's less suffering. No, like it trickles down. It's like really, really
Wait,
narrow-minded to be like,
so,
well,
so
this one species just has 100 million eggs, and they die really awful deaths, so maybe let's just get rid of that entire species. And it's like, that's really, it's weirdly narrow-sighted. Like, I don't understand why it's like, okay, well,
right,
well, one has really
I
awful
asked you
existences, so let's just get rid
before.
of the entire species. That doesn't make
Right, so I asked you before what reason you have to think that the spillover effect caused more suffering than well-being, because it could have a positive spillover that reduces the number of R strategists to the other species in which it spills over, right? So what do you have any argument as to why you think that the
your all your audio just got clipped out.
Yeah, try it again, buddy.
yeah, sorry, wait, I'll try putting in headphones. Let's see if that makes it better. Right, so the question, is it better now?
Seems so.
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, do you have an argument as to why you think that the ripple effects will cause more suffering than well-being overall?
I
Or so, yeah.
just overall, like, the shift in conversation has been quite great. So, like, okay, I don't really understand. Like, we're gonna harp on this for the next 5 minutes, and I'm gonna go to work.
Well, no, I mean, so just answer the question. So you made the claim that my position was wrong because environmental ripple effect. Do you have any reason to think that the environmental ripple effect will make it so that if an animal dies off, that will the ripple effects will cause more suffering than well-being?
Have you never seen, like, historically, if a species is gotten rid of, animals lose their food source? Like, this is very like common
Right, and
sense.
okay, right. So some animals leave their food source. That lose
Yes.
their food source. That's bad
Mhm.
for the animals who lose their food source. Good for their prey. Their prey might be the predators of other R strategists. The animals who lose their food source might be R strategists. There are just a huge number of possible situations that could result from it. But you have no argument to think that in expectation will cause more suffering than well-being.
and if it causes ecosystem harm such that it reduces the number.
Your definition of suffering well-being is different than mine at the end of the day, and at the end of the day, it ends up all coming back to affect humans. And at the end of the day, I'm a bit more of a human-centric person.
Wait,
So,
okay, so I mean, do you
so,
think it's okay
so
to like do you think it's okay to like kick dogs, for example?
I'm not an animal person.
So okay, but the question was, do you think it's okay to kick dogs if you think animals don't matter?
Most people wouldn't like that. Like, what's your?
Right, but
Oh
okay,
no.
you're not answering the question. Do you think it's okay to kick dogs if it seems to follow from animals not mattering that that if a human got enjoyment from kicking a dog, that would be morally neutral?
I think that would show a lot of signs of other issues. So typically, we don't like that type of thing because it usually leads to it becoming a bigger issue down the road. Most people don't just kick dogs and then go to work
Right.
like people.
So if we had a human who was otherwise well balanced, we could guarantee they would not spill over to them like harming humans. Would you be okay with them kicking a dog?
Sorry, I was just checking chat because people
Okay,
were
so if there
like,
yeah, so if there was a human who had no psychological conditions, they just enjoyed kicking dogs, and you knew that it would not result.
what are you getting at? Because we have like 3
Yeah, so
minutes.
what I'm getting at is you said animals don't matter. So I'm giving you a case where it seems to go against your intuitions to say that animals don't matter in the
I don't
face of.
say that. I didn't say animals don't matter overall. What I said is that at the end of the day, I care more about the what the end point ends up being for humans. And if we
Right,
get
so
rid
so
of,
in this case, the point for humans is overall good, right? The humans are happy, but it's only the dog who's worse off as a result of being kicked.
this is such like a general like non sequitur. Like, oh,
Oh,
I kind of got you. Oh, like no, like I'm
it
talking about
is
entire environments. I like this is doesn't matter about
all
this.
right.
Because what I'm saying is, okay,
You made an
we get rid of this type of fish. This type of fish no longer is able to feed this type of animal. This type of animal is the one that area needed to survive in terms of meat. So we get rid of
yeah.
it. Now there's less R predators, but at the end of the day, it ends
Our
up hurting
strategist.
animal. I don't care.
Yes.
I
So
don't care about the
okay.
name. Like we could just,
Yes.
I'd rather just
So
say fish and mammals. But
yes.
yeah, so there's
So
a mammal that
areas.
ends up eating that, and now we don't have that as a food source. Those people are entirely now destitute and don't have a form of income. Sorry, a form of food. But now this company is making
Yeah.
more
No.
money. Is that a net
So
win? Like but
you made.
now there's less suffering because now millions of this type of fish are no longer dying, even though like if we got rid of them and left it down to one fish, it would still be millions of fish that are dying. I don't yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, so you just pivoted to another point in response to the
Because at the
debate
end of the day,
over
I'm
whether
trying to
animals
talk
matter.
about trying to talk, but that's not what I'm trying to get to of whether or not animals
Well,
matter. What I'm saying is what my
okay.
moral system is more of I care about how it ends up affecting humans in the long run. And even we're talking about when it comes to eggs. Most humans actually give up like millions of sperm, and if
Yeah. So
we as
I.
women were able to
I
produce
mean,
millions of eggs, we would also be producing millions of kids all the time. But at the end of the day, that's not the way that our bodies reproduce.
right.
But
So I think it's amusing that earlier in the conversation, when I was making the point about how we can model economically the amount of harm that's caused by a certain action, you said, but that doesn't look at the impact that it has on the animals. It ignores the
the
animal suffering.
impacts that it has on, and I didn't say animal suffering. The
You,
impact it has on
I,
the animals
you
is what ends up being passed down to humans. So I care about the biodiversity because at the end of the day, that also affects humans.
Yeah, biodiversity does affect humans. The byproducts of pollution also affect humans. According to a Nobel Prize winner, the overall harms of warming or of like pollution abatement strategies such as the Kyoto Protocol are 5 times the total benefits just looking at the impacts on humans. The impacts on animals are positive overall because most animals live short lives of extreme suffering.
And I
Right.
disagree with that entire framework. Like
Which of those
but
claims do you
perhaps
disagree?
so perhaps they do live short lives of immense suffering. But at the end of the day, do we is this like a species that in total, humans have really shown to care like a lot about their suffering. Most people would have a problem with you kicking a dog due to the fact that people are like, well, like Fluffy is my pet, and it's like you kicking something that is my pet. If I grab a fish and I like drop kick it across the street, no one's gonna give a shit. So it's like those. It's all about
Wait,
like what
so
things do humans seem to care about more on average, and we're okay with going and like cooking fish at the end of the day. These are species that would
I
be considered
I don't think that we can model our morality based on what humans in fact care about, right? So I mean, there was a time when most humans, for example, in the United States, were okay with slavery, but I think it still was not okay despite the community consensus. I think that suffering is bad, even if the community is generally okay with that type of suffering.
We are so far from what the actual point of this debate is. It's like this is becoming a like fish or no fish argument where it's supposed to be more of an economics one. And
Well, yeah, so I gave you the economics thing. I said it Nobel Prize winners. I said it economic
you,
overwhelming
you,
consensus among economists. And then you brought up the point about the animals. So I gave an argument as to why it's good for the animals. Then you said you don't care about animals, and then said it's bad for humans. But there's still several arguments on the table as to why overall the harms to humans of
and I
of
yeah,
the
and what
environmental
I said is
regulation
that
is worse. The
if
harms
we
outweigh the
allow
benefits.
companies to make more money, I don't see that being a net positive at the end of the day because if a company does make more money, if we said, okay, well, I said this several times. If
Yeah,
a
so
company were to destroy an environment, but yet bring up so many jobs and offer all of those people jobs and say, hey, like we're getting rid of your food source, but we will introduce another food source, and these were some of the things that were put into place, then I would say, okay, maybe we could think about a bit more about this. But if it's just like, well, they're going to pay a tax, the tax is probably going to end up being to their own country, or the tax is going to end up going to the country which you're trying to build things, but that country doesn't necessarily distribute things in an amazing way. Then this doesn't help
okay,
anybody, and it just allows the
so
company to make more
yeah,
profit for the
so
sake of making profit.
the carbon tax proposals that have been given, I believe every single time that they've been proposed, if not in the vast majority of the time, the money has been redistributed as a UBI, right? So the claim that the government will just spend it on bad things is not true.
Did
But with
I didn't say bad
well, you said the
things, but
government wouldn't spend it on things that are important. They won't distribute it properly. Well, they spend it on a
well,
UBI.
okay. So a lot of times when we're talking about biodiversity and destroying environments, a big thing is a lot of it is environments outside of our country. So if like a rubber company wants to cut down more rubber trees, and all those trees happen to be in Brazil, sure you can pay tax at the wazoo, but who's that going to go to?
Yeah, so it is not relevant, right? It is not relevant. Well, it is relevant to some degree who the money goes based on the back end, but just in terms of creating optimal incentives so people only pollute if the benefits to them of pollution will outweigh the costs that they impose upon society. Then I think that
But
that
that's not really the cost benefit analysis that most companies do. It's not
well,
okay,
yeah,
the
well,
benefit to
they
us
do if they
versus the
impose a
cost to
Pigouvian tax.
society.
They do if they impose a Pigouvian tax because they get the benefits in terms of profits, and then they get the costs based on the tax that is imposed upon them.
Yes, and they get the cost of the tax, but the cost of the tax is not necessarily equivalent to the cost to society, and companies are not going to
Okay,
go and do
well,
that
we
analysis of
set
what
the
the difference
tax.
is.
We set the tax at the cost imposed upon society, and
But how
according to
is that going to be different from each area to each area? If you want to
yes,
if you want to build something in the middle of Rio, it's going to be this much. If you want to build something in the Amazon, it's this
yeah,
much.
I mean, different localities should have different d- types of taxes based on the different amounts of environmental. But for example, carbon taxes should be relatively consistent, given that the harm of carbon is similar regardless of where it's released.
Yeah, so I agree that like taxes are fine because that ends up polluting an area. And I honestly I don't find that carbon taxes are enough. But if we want to think about the idea of implementing a carbon tax, that's fine for already industrialized areas. But adding this additional tax and saying yes, as long as you pay what this amount is, and Yeah, you're just giving money to essentially create profit, but yeah, like fuck everyone that lives there because like yeah, go get that bag, Bezos. Like that's not I don't care what the amount of money
Yeah,
that they would be giving, it wouldn't be able to outweigh what negatives are for me.
but your policies result in the same type of regression. And according to the Levinson study, the policies of
Right.
command and control
I don't
regulation
you act
are
like as if
on
I know what
average.
the Levingston study is, and if you say according to Levingston study, I'm going like, oh,
Well,
actually, no,
yeah,
you're
so
right.
the study done in 2011, I believe. I mean, so it found that generally carbon tax that generally command and control regulations, the type that you advocate, are more regressive than carbon taxes because
And what's your definition of regressive?
impose disproportionately high costs on low income people.
And disproportionately high costs. And I think once again, this ends up being circular because I say once again, if we add this tax, will will the profits be trickled down to the consumer? Will I get a discount? And the answer is I don't
Yes.
know. So yeah,
Well,
oh, best
wait,
every time.
no, wait. If we impose a tax, then you won't get lower prices, obviously.
Okay, so then
Taxes taxes result in higher prices, not lower prices. But command and control regulate they make it so that there are higher prices for consumers, which is why they generally cut away from the profits of low income people. Or command and control regulation generally are worse for low income people than carbon taxes are proportional.
and I don't see any type of data proving that if we were to go from doing what do you call it, blocking off the ability for people to build somewhere or shifting to taxing them, that's suddenly going to make the lives of consumers immensely better.
Well, so regardless of what the money is spent on, it's just a question of whether or
Not
not.
about no, I'm not saying what the money is spent on, but if we're talking about how the prices, the lack of profits that companies are making, and that being trickled down to the consumer, I don't see any type of data that we have saying that if we shifted to another model, suddenly all products would drop by 50%.
Well, wait, I mean, do you think that there's some magical property about a carbon tax that makes it so that only a carbon tax trickles down to higher prices for consumers, but command and control regulation raise of
You just blocked out a
yeah,
little bit.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah. But command and control regulations that raise the costs of construction or don't raise the costs to consumers at all. Is that your view?
I never said that they don't raise the cost to
Okay,
consumers, but the
so
whole
you agree.
idea is that one raises the cost of consumers. I don't see any data saying that the other one doesn't either.
Wait, so they both raise the cost to consumers, right? You agree with that?
I would I would say that that's intuitively what I would say. If you have some type of data that next
Yeah, I
time
mean,
you actually want to come with, so I can read ahead of time that says otherwise, then I would have checked that. But
yeah, so I do, right? The Levinson study. But so I mean, it is just a basic tenet of economics that if it costs more to produce, it shifts over the demand curve, and so as a result of that, you get higher prices. Okay, so both of these systems will result in higher prices for consumers, but they also result in benefits to people. So there are benefits and there are costs to both of those policies. However, the consensus amongst economists, including Nobel Prize winning economists, generally that the benefits outweigh the costs in one case, and in the other case, the costs outweigh the benefits, and that your policy is worse for low income consumers.
and I don't have any data saying that the other one would be better for low income consumers.
Right. So are you at this point agnostic unto whether your position? I mean, why at this point? Why do you think command and control regulations are better?
As I said, it preserves the ecosystems.
So does a carbon tax. Why do you think that it's better at preserving the ecosystem for a lower cost?
Pardon?
A carbon tax also preserves the ecosystem. Why do you think it's better at preserving the ecosystem at a lower cost?
I'm okay with people further creating concrete jungles and things that are already concrete jungles, but saying that there's environmental regulations at times as entails no longer having certain sorry, um shifting from having environmental regulations to choosing to have this tax will at times allow there to be certain types of chemicals in the environment that are really bad for ozone,
Right.
destroying
So, but yeah,
ecosystems,
so
etc.
that Katarana, that's not an answer to the question. So the question is, so they both have benefits and they have costs. What reason do
Yes.
you have? What?
So they
Right.
both have benefits and they have costs, but I don't think that the benefits of having the tax are better than the outweigh the cost of having a tax.
What is your basis for this belief?
I was just saying, and then that wasn't, and then you said that's not an
No,
answer.
you're talking about concrete jungles. Now, some things are bad for the environment, but if they were bad for the environment, they would pay huge amounts of money that would presumably make it not profitable to the business. And some things that are bad for the
So
environment are
if we're gonna put a tax that's so high that it's not
no,
necessarily.
the tax wouldn't be that high. It would be, I think, $16. According to Nordhaus's paper, which won a Nobel Prize. I think maybe 25. I don't know. I could be off.
$25 for what?
Per I'm blanking on the units of carbon. I think ton.
Okay, but if we're talking about things such as destroying environments, are we not gonna give a tax for that? Is that like you can do that? That's
Yeah,
fine.
so we would also impose a tax on environmental destruction, right?
I
Well,
just
no, I mean,
don't see like okay, you can do it as long as you give us money. Like
right. So
I
yeah,
don't.
there
It's
are
not a
costs,
system I
there are
agree with.
benefits, and so we want people to only do it if the benefits outweigh by making them pay the costs and
And as I
garner the
said,
benefits and
but this is
profits.
so
They'll
we
only
keep
do it
on
if the benefits
going
are
in
already.
circles and circles because I already gave you an answer on this too.
Your
Like I
your answer was, well, companies don't use their money for good.
no,
That's
I said at the end of the day, there may be one company that will say, "Wow, that's too much. We can't afford that," and there's another company that say, okay, it's fine." And at the end of the day, they will still go and do that. And I just don't see that as being a net positive, even though that they're paying $25 per every tree that they cut down, because $25 per every tree that we cut down is not like a good enough I guess offset to the amount of destruction that there is.
Well, I mean, it is so. It depends on what you mean by offsets, right? So if you mean by just making it so that
Your entire sentence is not coming through.
oh wait, okay. So if by offsetting you mean that just all of the harms just go away, obviously that's not going to be the case. Um, But I mean, we could make it so that the money that we garner through a carbon tax is used, or through other Pigouvian taxes, are used to fund environmental cleanup, and I think that that would be a reasonable thing, given that the most efficient cost, the most efficient way of reducing a ton of CO2, um, costs a lot less than the social cost of carbon. So the social cost of carbon is like 15, 16 or $20 or something. But the cost to reduce a ton of carbon, if you donate it to Cool Earth, which is the most effective the most effective organization at reducing
It's
environmental
not just
destruction,
carbon. Like
it
it's not
only
just
or
carbon.
the cost to offset is about 38 cents per ton, which is many, many, many times less than the social cost. What things do you think cannot be offset?
So circular. It's like the same. I keep having to bring up the same points over and over.
Wait,
Like, yes, there's
what part
carbon,
of it?
but at the end of the day, if you get rid of a species, it doesn't matter if you give $16 per every CO2 emission that you're giving, because that species does not come back. Like,
Wait, okay, so yeah, so I agree that species destruction is something that, if a species is entirely wiped out, then that could not come
but
back. But
even if it's not entirely wiped out, like you disturbing, let's say, a specific lake now is completely and now there's not another body of water for another 10 kilometers. You putting all of your pollutants into that lake, even if you're paying a tax for cleanup, that at the end of the lake, that section that you're putting your pollutants in can no longer inhabit a certain type of species, an entire type of ecosystem. Now these animals are having to travel an extra 10 kilometers to go there. A lot of them may not be able to make it over there without having a food source. Now we're collapsing ecosystems, and it doesn't matter if you put $16, $20, $1,000. That doesn't fix the ecosystem. And like, there's not anything that you can do. May it be a carbon tax, you can clean up oceans from now until the end of time. That doesn't fix the ecosystem
yeah,
overall.
so I agree with you that there are some environmental harms that cannot be offset, but there are other environmental harms that can be offset. So my point is just that,
And I'm
these
saying that the ones that can't be offset, if 100%
but
of them
just
cannot
because
be
something
offset, then I don't think it's worth it. I think yes,
so
fine, whatever. Put all of it into slowing down global warming, but okay, great. Now we have a lot less carbon emissions going on, and the projections seem a lot brighter for the future. But now an entire area, a 50 kilometer radius, is having an issue finding
okay.
food,
So
and is that worth
do
it
you
just
think
because there's now
yeah,
other? And
so so
I don't agree. That's
yeah, so do you think that there's like infinite disvalue to doing something to wiping out a species if it's irreversible?
if we can go and if we get rid of a certain type of let's say flea that's and that's the only thing that gets wiped out, and the only thing that flea was doing was destroying crops and nothing was eating it, and it wasn't even let's say it wasn't indigenous to that area, so it didn't have any form of predator that had to live off of it, and it was just being invasive. If that was the only net lost, and I'd be like, cool, whatever. But that's usually not what ends up happening. It's
Right.
not
Yeah.
just we end
So,
up getting rid
so
of
there are
invasive
there are
species.
obviously ripple effects, but you have no argument as to why the ripple effects are in expectation negative. I agree with you that we are going in to some degree. I
Okay.
mean, I think that's as my view is that that's as a consequence of you not having responses to the arguments I've made. But
And you keep on
yeah,
asking me questions that I've answered. That's
well, yeah. So I mean, we can move to another related point, which is so you brought up the argument that that you don't really care very much about the wild animal suffering because you don't. So what about animals makes it so that you don't assign them any moral worth?
this doesn't is what's the point?
Well, the point is that I think that you cannot give a consistent criterion that would not justify absurd reductio. Um, that would explain why you don't care about humans, right? Or sorry, why you don't care about animals. So I'm trying to argue that animals do matter, okay? And
Okay,
so,
and I think we just have a difference in cultural perspectives. Like my
oh yeah, so but I'm
but
asking you to give an argument, right? So what about animals makes it so that they don't matter?
it's a difference in cultural perspectives. That's
Well,
essentially.
no, so that's just explaining that we disagree. But so I'm asking why we disagree. So I'm asking
But
what
I'm
about
saying uh, oh, and I just don't understand why you as a person that is arguing for it's okay to destroy habitats is then saying that I, as someone that doesn't want to destroy habitats, which does not end up killing animals, are asking me why don't I have a particular moral worth to animals
yeah,
when you're the one
so
that's killing them.
So I mean, as I explained before, I think that what
And,
that
and then at the same time, I gave an
ecosystems.
answer saying, okay, yes, so the ecosystem end up having a lot of things that die. And then I gave the answer of, that's great, but the ones that you think are not having a miserable existence also end up dying. Now we're back at the same point. So can we skip over
Yeah.
this? I'm literally giving, it's the same question, answer,
No.
question, answer.
I gave you an argument, and you disagreed with none of the premises. Nor did you disagree conclusion that there's way more suffering than well-being in nature. And so then then you pivoted and you just said, well, it wasn't a pivot, I guess. It was responsive. You said that you don't care about animals. So now I'm trying to get you to give a
Saying
justification.
my worldview does
Okay,
not assign the
saying,
same
saying
amount of
yes,
worth to animals as humans.
it is obviously the case that that is your view. I'm asking you to give a justification for that view.
And
So
I'm
what is
saying that at the end of the day, I don't understand why you are asking me that because I'm the one that wants to keep them alive for
oh
the
wait,
purpose of humans, and you're saying it's okay to kill them.
if the question is not relevant, then there would be no harm in answering it, right? If the question is not relevant and if it's
Like,
just a red
this
herring.
is like the same thing as when I had the debate with the flat earther and he kept on talking about heliocentrism. It doesn't matter. So I'm not, no. I don't feel like, okay, do you want to talk about like
Well, no,
pineapple on pizza while we're at it? Like,
this does matter because one of your arguments against my position was that animals don't matter, and so I'm asking you to justify why animals don't matter, and you're not answering the question. And so, if you're giving an argument against my position, you have to actually be willing to answer questions about that argument, right?
and my answer for that was I gave a whole under like why I want to, and like I'm gonna give you the same response again. It doesn't matter what my particular reason is. At the end of the day, it could be for anything. Maybe an animal ate my mom, whatever. But at the end of the day, I'm the one. My argument is not I hate animals and thus we should kill them. I said I don't
Well,
particularly care for them,
your
and I
argument
think we can keep
your
them
argument
alive the
is
way
that
that they are because
your argument is that you don't care about literally quadrillions of years of intense agony just on a scale that we can't imagine. I mean, well,
okay, and once again, my response was the ones you care about that feel like have great lives also end up dying from your policy.
right. So that it is true that some of those die. So that is a downside. But then there's also an upside. But trillions of years of agony as a downside outweighs the much smaller number
You also were saying
of
that you
animals
think
living.
if somebody is able to be alive for trillions of years and have absolutely amazing lives, does it outweigh the fact that they end up dying at the end? So would you also say for the types of animals that you think are okay to keep alive, such as mammals, which most of them, that's mostly what it is, that end up living and then dying after 10, 15 years. Most of these types of animals end up having fruitful lives. So why is it worth it to you to allow those to also end up dying as a result of getting rid of these other ones that you consider to have awful lives? So are you just doing like a number thing? Like, okay, so 8 deers are produced for every 1,000,000 salmon, and 1,000,000 salmon end up creating 6,000 a year's worth of suffering, while 8 deers have 100 years worth of good things. And that account is that how you're counteracting?
Yeah, so I'm so I think that there are bad experiences and there are good experiences. Now, when I'm talking about utility, I'm talking about Neumann or VNM utility, which means that it's additive, right? So a 1/2 chance of 2 units of utility is equally good to a 100% chance of 1 unit of utility. It's the way the utility function is defined. And so, and conversely, a 1 utility and then 1 unit of -1 utility, those conglomeration of experiences would be overall neutral. So I'm saying that based on VNM utility, it follows trivially that if animals have enough units of utility in their life such that their well-being outweighs, it is better from a utilitarian standpoint that they exist. And so I think that that's true of many of the K strategies. But for many of the R strategists, that is not the case, right? So as a result of that, I think that it would be better if there were not R strategists.
Okay, and then it loops back around.
Well, no, it doesn't loop back around. You just have no argument except like posturing about how the position is counterintuitive. And I agree that the position is counterintuitive.
I'm not posturing. I'm telling you exactly what ends up happening, and I'm saying that the
Right,
animals that you see that you care about also end up dying.
which of the arguments that I've made do you disagree? Do you disagree with the empirical claim that there's more suffering than well-being, or do you disagree with the moral claim that we should maximize the well-being of conscious creatures?
Can you repeat the two options?
The empirical claim that animals have way more suffering than well-being, or the moral claim that we should maximize the balance of well-being over suffering?
I just it's kind of like the like I just don't understand like why so much of like adding up the numbers like
Okay,
the ones that you care about end up
that's not a
dying.
rejection. So that's not a rejection of either of the arguments.
Why does that? Why do I necessarily need to reject both of them to still disagree with you, or I reject one of them?
Okay, so I mean, I can give you like a syllogism. I can type it in VC chat. P1, we should maximize the well-being of conscious creatures. P2, destroying ecosystems maximizes the well-being of conscious creatures. Therefore, we should destroy ecosystems. Oh, and for the chat who's asking, I bite the repugnant. Well, I don't think it's much of a bullet to bite. I agree with Michael Humer's paper in defense of repugnance.
So you want to?
Yeah. So which of the arguments that I've given do you disagree with? Do you disagree that it would maximize well-being to destroy
And
ecosystems?
I said again, why do I have to disagree with them for me to disagree?
Well, because the conclusion follows from the argument.
And what if I disagree?
Well, then you would have to deny logic. Like this argument is formally valid.
Okay, so what's your full thing?
Okay,
Like,
premise
well,
one, we should
why is
we
yours specifically the more logical conclusion than mine? Like, at the end of the day, I think that I'm able to say the same thing as you, but still come to my conclusion. While you think that if I don't come to your conclusion, that means that I'm disagreeing with you. Like on the two, like, ethics claims. But at the end of the day, I'm still coming to my conclusion without disagreeing with you. And who says that like yours is the sole way that somebody could maximize happiness, but also like decrease suffering? Because in my eyes, it's like we get rid of one type of suffering, but it also propagates a bunch of other types of suffering. And at the end of the day, it doesn't maximize happiness. So I believe it's better to keep the system that we currently
logic
have.
works, right, is that if a conclusion follows from premises and you don't dispute the premises, then you have to agree with the conclusion, right?
But I just said I can agree with what the two things are. I don't like suffering and I want to maximize happiness and still end up my conclusion. You just say that like, no, my conclusion is the only morally ethical one is that we have to just go ahead and propose a tax because it gets rid of the most suffering. And I say, I don't believe yours does get rid of the most suffering. And then it just depends on like on what scale are you looking. You're looking like directly on I'm getting rid of fish and they seem to suffer a lot. And I'm thinking you're also getting rid of humans and that will end up causing a form of suffering as well. And like you don't have the moral absolutism on like which conclusion ends up being the more moral one. Like
so I mean, okay, so if the conclusion follows, so what you're saying would be a rejection of a premise two, which is that destroying ecosystems is an action that maximizes the well-being of conscious creatures. But given just the trillions of years of agony, I mean, more than trillions, there are quadrillions of animals who exist, and most of them have like thousands of descendants who have like huge numbers of years of suffering. So it's like
Omni, your conclusion essentially leads to let's get rid of every type of animal that ends up not having the majority of their offspring make it to maturity.
No, that's not the conclusion. The conclusion is we should destroy ecosystems if they have our strategy.
Okay, and that's called every ecosystem has them. So let's get rid of every ecosystem.
Well, no, so we should only destroy them in certain cases, right? So if we're utilitarians, we weigh the costs and the benefits. Now, I am against the collapse of industrial civilization. I think that the end of the world would be bad because I think humans get a lot of well-being, and I think particularly in the far future, humans have the capacity for large amounts of well-being, right? But I mean, I think that, so I'm not an anti-natalist, but I do think that it is good when I'm not an anti-natalist in a human context, but in a context of animals who have millions of offspring, most of whom die after like a few hours of existence, then there's more suffering than well-being. I care about maximizing the balance of suffering over well-being. So I would be in favor of making that ecosystem smaller. And this is a conclusion that other people like Brian Tomasic and Oscar Horta have come to.
Those people don't mean anything to me. I don't know who they are. So I guess, and this is the same conclusion that Albert Einstein and Feynman came up to. Okay, I don't know who these people are. Also, okay, now I found my first chatter, so I actually have to probably go because I was waiting for someone to actually need my help at work, and now somebody does.
Okay. All right. Well,
but I don't know. Overall, this is super, super like circular, and I don't think there's really like. I just think I understand that some of the points like wasn't a diversion because it had to get to like the moral system, but we're just kind of going the same thing, and it's like at the end of the day, like none of us are going to end up conceding here because I don't agree with you and you don't agree with me. You just think that your system is super logical, and I say no, I think mine's more logical, and just like at the end of the day,
I mean,
this isn't.
I mean, I'll give my read of the conversation, which is that I gave a you did not have an objection to the arguments, but then you just objected to the conclusion and appealed to your intuitions about the
Yeah, and
conclusion.
it's not always appeal to intuition. I don't just say like I feel like I really like doggos and I don't want them to die. I say that no, this actually causes like a lack in like biodiversity, which ends up trickling down to humans and causes more net harm than net good. So even if a company can pay off the tax, I don't think that adding more money to the federal government is necessarily like worth destroying a bunch of people's lives. And people, like a lot of cultures are very tied to where they're living, so just offsetting them and putting them somewhere else causes a lot of issues. We can see it consistently when it comes to the displacement of indigenous people, that even if we are able to give them a different place, that's not good enough, like especially with ecosystems that people are consistently looking into destroying. So I don't think that your idea of like, yeah, just putting a tax in because it'll help with carbon is worth a lot of the changes in biodiversity. And then from there you say, well, like it's the art strategies that I want to get rid of. And then I say, no, I don't agree with you. And you say, okay, well, my one is the more moral one because I gave these two axioms and you agree with my axioms and this is the logical conclusion to my axioms. And I say, I don't agree with you. So that's essentially what this ended up being.